The gold rush had turned the valley into a living furnace of dust and noise. All day the air tasted of sifted ore and wet timber, and all night the camp's lanterns flickered like tired stars above claims cut into red-brown earth. Men argued over lines staked with splintered stakes and stubborn promises. They spoke of river bends as if the water belonged to whoever shouted first. Calder moved through it all the way wind moved through sage, quietly, watching, never lingering where eyes would notice him. He had come west with ideas that now fit in the palm of his hand. Keep your word, help when you can, and don't volunteer for trouble. The trouble in this place was trouble that bred in daylight. It grew in sight of the cook fire and under the same sky that held blue mornings and violent storms. The river dispute was the camp's newest religion. On paper, the land ran one way. In practice, men put their boots where they pleased. The river fed the diggings, and the best sluice runs depended on where the current was bent by stones and old log jams. Tonight, the men said, there would be a vote, an election of sorts, on who had the right to clear the bank and build new planks. They called it fairness. They called it order. Calder had heard enough sermons from men with lamps and clubs. That afternoon the storm came early, not like gentle rain, but like a lid being pulled from the sky. The clouds gathered low, dragging their bellies over the gulch. Lightning cracked behind the hills, and the camp's noise thickened as if sound itself tried to dodge the first drops. Calder was near the river when he saw the change in men's posture, the subtle stiffening that meant something had arrived and all courtesy had been replaced with calculation. A wagon had come from the upstream road. It was a buckboard, the kind with wheels that complained like tired animals. Two guards rode high on it, both broad-shouldered and grinning in a way that never reached their eyes. Behind them, a third man walked beside the wagon with the authority of someone who already knew what everyone would decide. Mossy was on the wagon bed under a blanket that kept slipping. The blanket was dark wool, but dampness stained it so the color had turned dull and ugly. Her wrists were bound with a cord that had rubbed the skin raw, and when she shifted to breathe, the cord tightened and left faint red ridges like writing. She wasn't helpless in the way men expected. She kept her chin lifted, eyes sharp enough to make a liar feel cold. Even when the lightning flashed and turned the camp river into a silver blade, Mossy watched her surroundings like a woman reading danger in the lines of wind. Calder knew what others would call her, different names, different guesses, but he didn't need them to see her as human. He had learned long ago that people were not puzzles you solved for entertainment. People were consequences. Vernon stepped down from the wagon as if he belonged to the ground. He wore a miner's coat, thick with dust, but the storm had made it look like armor. His hands were clean in the wrong way, clean enough to be intentional, clean enough to indicate he had others do the messy work. "This is how we settle it," Vernon said, loud enough for the men to hear, as if the river dispute required theater. "Right here, right now. You can't dig with one man's planks and another man's shove, so we settle the bank and we settle the water. We settle it like grown folk." Someone laughed, too high and too fast. Others nodded as if nodding could wash guilt away. Vernon gestured toward Mossy. "This woman, she's been trouble. She's been seen around the upstream claims. She's been caught by the wrong men on the wrong nights. And if she's caught again, she won't be breathing to see the next sunrise." The guards chuckled. Calder saw Mossy flinch at the sound more than at the words. Her body had learned fear as a language. But Mossy looked at Vernon, not at the guards. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried, the way a calm voice carried over a storm because it didn't waste itself on shouting. "River takes what it's shown," she said. "You show it cruelty, it learns it." Vernon's smile tightened. "Woman talks like she's got rights." A murmur rose. Calder didn't join it. He stayed half a step behind a stack of split logs, letting the men think they hadn't chosen him to notice. Mossy's gaze searched for a way out. Not just an escape from the wagon, but an escape from the story the camp wanted to tell. She swallowed once, throat working hard. Then Vernon spoke again, and the words turned sharp. "We don't waste time. There's a choice. You can all witness the verdict, or you can all pretend you don't know how land is taken. Either way, the river runs for whoever clears the bank. So, he made a show of it, as if the men needed permission to be cruel. We'll see if the Apache woman floats. The guards jerked Mossy forward. When she stumbled, they caught her with hands that grabbed too hard. Her head dipped as if she might bargain, but her eyes never left the river. The river pulled at the air around it, sucking in smells of wet stones and silt. Calder stepped closer despite himself. He didn't move like a rescuer. He moved like a man about to argue about a fence post. The camp didn't fear his kind of disruption. They expected it. "What's that, Vernon?" Calder asked, voice flat. Vernon looked him over, irritated that the storm didn't excuse it from being interrupted. "Not your business. This is a claim matter." Calder kept his hands visible. "It's raining cats and dogs. Ain't no claim matter worth a drowning." Someone laughed again, eager to watch a fight. Vernon leaned forward a fraction. "You got a soft spot, Calder?" "Soft or not," Calder said. "A man who wants to settle a river dispute by tossing a bound woman into it ain't settling nothing but his own appetite." The guards shifted. Their boots splashed in shallow puddles. Lightning flashed, turning everyone's faces pale for a heartbeat. Vernon's eyes narrowed. "You'd stop it?" Calder looked at Mossy. She held herself like a woman preparing for the oldest kind of violence. When the guards tugged her toward the edge of the bank, her shoulders tightened, and for a moment, Calder feared she would fight and bring the men's hands down harder. But Mossy didn't scream. She didn't curse. She watched the guards' grips, watched the angle of their bodies. Her eyes moved like she was counting seconds. Calder made his decision quickly, the kind of decision that burned later. The first guard had reached the wagon's side rope. Calder stepped between him and the river like a wall. "You want to fight?" Calder asked. "No," Vernon said, almost spitting the word. "I want her out of the way." Calder heard the crowd settle into expectation. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted Calder to either become a hero or become a warning. Instead, he reached to his own belt and pulled a coil of spare rope. It looked casual, but his fingers were steady. "Then tie her up better, or take the matter to the marshal, but don't use water as your excuse." Vernon hesitated. That hesitation, small as a nail, told Calder something. Vernon wasn't afraid of violence. He was afraid of witnesses. In a mining camp, witnesses were currency. The storm cracked again. The river swelled, and for a moment the current looked like it had teeth. Mossy shifted her bound wrists, and Calder saw the cord had been knotted in a clumsy way. Whoever bound her had done it quickly, thinking speed was safety. Mossy's calm wasn't resignation, it was assessment. Calder said quietly, so only Mossy might hear, "If you can free your hands, run toward the cottonwood. You'll find a split in the roots. It's deep." Mossy's eyes flicked to his face, then away, as if she didn't trust hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Should I trust you?" "Because I'm still alive," Calder said, and he meant it. Because someone had once turned back, and he had built his life on the memory. The guard grabbed Mossy again, turning her toward the water. Calder tightened his grip on the rope and stepped in. He let his shoulder bump the guard hard enough to make him stumble. He didn't swing. He didn't want to draw blood. In this world, blood turned men into animals and forced everyone to choose sides. Chaos arrived anyway. The guard stumbled backward, boots sliding on mud. Mossy's feet touched the bank's edge, and for a moment the river's roar swallowed everything. The guards shouted. Vernon barked an order. Mossy moved. When the guard's hands reached for her again, she twisted her wrists against the knot, using pain like a tool. The cord slipped just enough. One finger free. Then another. Lightning flashed, exposing the raw red ridges where rope had bitten. Mossy caught Calder's rope coil with one unbound hand and pulled it tight around her own waist in a way that looked practiced. Then she ran. Water slapped the bank in thick sheets. The storm turned the camp into a blur of swinging lanterns. Mossy sprinted toward the cottonwood Calder had pointed out, her feet finding traction in the mud the way some animals found paths they were born knowing. The crowd surged for a view, But Calder stayed close, stepping to block the guards from following too easily. He kept his body between Mossy and Vernon's orders. "After her!" Vernon shouted. Calder didn't say he would not. He simply moved like a man who had already decided. He grabbed the closest guard's suspenders and yanked him back, making the man stumble. Then Calder turned and raced toward the cottonwood. Mossy was already at the split in the roots. She shoved aside wet leaves and pushed herself into darkness that smelled of damp earth and old rot. Calder saw her disappear up to her shoulders before another guard reached the tree. Calder thrust his rope coil into the guard's hands. "Hold the rope," he ordered, voice hard, "or you'll drag the whole bank down." The guard hesitated, confused by Calder's certainty. The storm made every choice slippery. In that moment, Mossy's muffled voice came from the roots. "The land's older than your vote," she said. "You'll spend gold to buy a right you don't have." Calder crouched near the split but didn't climb in. He wasn't built for disappearing into places without air. He leaned close enough to hear her breathing. "Do you have a way out?" "Tonight," Mossy said. "Not without cost." Calder's throat tightened. "What cost?" Mossy exhaled slowly. "They brought me to make a show. You interrupted the show. That means you're part of it now." Outside, men were shouting over one another, about what they'd seen, what they'd been told, what the river owed them. The storm hammered the ground so hard it felt like the earth wanted to shake itself clean of what happened. Calder stood and looked back toward the camp. Vernon stood under a dripping awning, his face furious. The miner's lamp at his belt swung, throwing yellow light across slick boots. Calder understood suddenly. This wasn't about a river vote at all. It was about who controlled the sluice line, and with it, the flow of wealth upstream. Mossy's presence had been used like a match, but why her? Why toss her into the river instead of simply staking a new plank? Calder's mind ran through what he'd heard about Apache bands moving through high desert and timbered valleys, bands that knew water better than any map. Vernon had wanted the camp to remember the river decision as righteous. If Mossy drowned, or if she looked like she might drown, the men would feel justified in grabbing the bank. Mercy would undermine the story. So Mossy was a threat not only to land, but to the narrative the camp depended on. Calder turned back to the cottonwood. "Can you move through the root split and come out where the river can't see you?" Mossy's voice came again, closer now. "Yes, but you must lead them away." Calder let out a soft laugh that wasn't humor. "Lead them away? I ain't the kind of man with tricks." "You're the kind who turns," Mossy replied. "Turning is a trick." Calder didn't argue. He knew what turning meant in frontier life. It meant choosing the harder road when the easier one offered approval. It meant making enemies when neutrality still seemed possible. He eased into the root's shadow as far as he could, careful not to crush Mossy's hidden space. His breath caught. The smell of damp earth clung to his coat. The darkness pressed in. Then he heard Mossy move. A scrape. Cloth shifting. Her breath was steady, but her body wasn't. When she emerged, she did it like a decision. Quick, practiced, and dangerous. She was pale under the lantern's light, hair slick with rain, eyes bright and furious. Calder noticed something at her throat, a beaded strip that looked like decoration but carried meaning. He had seen similar work once, years back, in an encampment near a trading post. The beads weren't jewelry, they were history. Mossy held up her hands, showing the rope marks were still there. "They can't find the bead strip," she murmured. "What bead strip?" Calder asked, though he already understood she wasn't talking about beads the way a miner might. "Mine," she said. "It's the deed you don't know you've been stealing." Calder's heart jolted. "Deed?" Mossy shook her head as if the word tasted wrong. "Not paper, not ink. Proof in what we remember and how we mark the land. You white men love paper because it lies neatly." Calder felt heat in his chest, anger at the injustice and fear at how big this might be. The river vote, the camp's cruelty, the land dispute. None of it was simple. Nothing here was. They moved fast, slipping away from the cottonwood and into the dark behind a line of boulders. The storm had washed away tracks, making their feet harder to follow. Calder kept his lantern off, relying on moon flashes between cloud breaks. As they went, Mossy watched him. "You didn't run to the marshal." Calder's mouth went dry. "Marshal's part of the town. Town's part of Vernon." Mossy stared. "Then why help?" Calder didn't answer at first. The simple answer was easy, because he couldn't watch a woman drown. But there was a deeper reason, quieter than pride. "I saw what they did," he said finally. "Before. Not to you, to another. A few years back, she was bound and thrown in front of men who swore they were decent." Mossy's expression softened, barely. "They always swear." "And she lived," Calder said, "because one man ran after her when the rest watched. He didn't do it for praise. He just did it because if he didn't, he would never forgive himself." Mossy's eyes held his like a challenge. "So you forgive yourself with me?" Calder swallowed. "Maybe. Or maybe I've been waiting to turn again." They reached a bend where the camp's noise thinned. Behind a stand of willows, Calder found a half-collapsed shed used for storing river tools. He pushed the door open with care, letting Mossy inside first. The shed's interior smelled of old rope and wet wood. He set down his coat and laid it near the floor. "Sit," he said. Mossy's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "You order like a man with authority." "I don't have authority," Calder replied. "I have hands, and you're shaking." Mossy tried to steady her breathing, but her body betrayed her. The rope marks were fresh, and the cold had already begun to creep into her bones. Calder struck a flint, and after a few tries, he coaxed a small coal into life. It wasn't much. It was enough. He warmed his fingers, then held the coal near Mossy's hands without touching her. "Your wrists," he said. Mossy pulled her shawl closer, stubborn even in vulnerability. "Not broken." Calder nodded. He could tell the difference between injury and shock. He also knew he needed to be careful. In frontier life, care could become a kind of capture. He offered water in a battered tin cup. Mossy drank slowly, eyes never fully closing. When the storm finally pushed beyond the valley, the world quieted. The river kept moving, indifferent. From far away, the camp still shouted, as if the men needed noise to keep their consciences from speaking. Calder listened. "They'll look for you," he said. "They already decided," Mossy replied. "They'll pretend they couldn't find me. They'll call you a fool for trying." Calder exhaled. "Let them. I'm used to being called a fool." Mossy's gaze shifted to his hands, to the rope burns and the scar. "You're not a fool," she said. "You're a man who can't leave a debt unpaid." Calder felt the words strike somewhere inside him. "You don't owe me anything." "Don't be so sure," Mossy said. "I owe my people." He blinked. "What do you mean?" Mossy's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she looked like she was not in a shed, but on a hillside watching a horizon. "My people don't travel this valley to be chased by miners," she said. "We came because the river line was sacred, not because it was pretty, because it held something, springs and old channels that our elders taught us to read. The white men never saw those channels. They only saw profit." Calder frowned. "So Vernon, he's taking more than water." Mossy's mouth tightened. "He's taking names. He's taking memory. He's taking proof that the land belongs to those who know it." Calder's chest felt heavy. "Where's the proof?" Mossy reached under her shawl and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She untied it carefully, revealing a strip of beaded leather and a flat stone etched with symbols Calder couldn't read. "This," she said, "this was carried by my mother. It marked the river's oldest boundary. It was hidden when the land was stolen by treaty talk and threat talk. When my mother died, the boundary was supposed to be brought to the right place." Calder stared. "A boundary deed," he said, slow. Mossy nodded. "But not for your courts, for our keeping, for whoever knows how to listen." Calder had expected danger and survival. He hadn't expected the kind of history that could change what men thought they owned. From outside, a distant clatter grew louder, boots and voices nearing. Calder reached for his rifle that leaned against the wall. It had been his friend longer than he'd wanted. The shed door rattled. Before Calder could move, Mossy pressed a hand to his arm. Her touch was cold but firm. "If they find you here, they'll say you kidnapped me," she whispered. Calder's jaw clenched. "Let them." "They will believe it because they want to," Mossy said. "And because I'm Apache." The word landed like a stone. Calder understood the camp's cruelty more clearly now. It wasn't only greed, it was prejudice shaped into policy. The door swung open. 2 guards entered first, lantern held high. Their faces were red with rain and rage. "Where is she?" one demanded. Calder stepped forward, making his body larger. "She left, before you came." The guard laughed. "You ain't gonna talk your way out." Then a third figure entered behind them. Vernon. The storm's remnants clung to his coat like wet dirt. His expression was sharp enough to cut leather. Vernon looked around the shed, eyes landing on the small coal, on Mossy's shawl, on Calder's rifle. He didn't need to confirm much. He needed to enforce. "You've been handy," Vernon said to Calder. "You interfering has consequences." Calder kept his face steady. "You tried to throw her in the river like she was a carcass." Vernon's gaze flicked to the guards, then back. "She's an obstacle. Obstacles move aside." Mossy stood now, shoulders squared. She didn't try to look smaller. She didn't beg. "What did you think would happen when you brought me for the camp's vote?" Mossy asked Vernon. Vernon's mouth tightened. "That depends. Did you drown?" Mossy smiled faintly, and the smile was more dangerous than anger. "No." Vernon stepped forward. "Then you'll go. Now." Calder lifted his rifle slightly. "No." In that moment, the old rules of frontier life tried to take hold. Men stepped into lines and settled disputes with steel. But something else happened first. Mossy spoke, and her voice turned the shed's air heavy. "You want proof?" she asked Vernon. "Ask the river who owns it." Vernon frowned. "What in blazes?" Mossy pointed toward the corner of the shed where Calder had kept his satchel of supplies. "You're looking for what you think I carry." She reached into her shawl and held up the beaded strip and stone, visible now under lantern light. Vernon's eyes sharpened instantly. The greed was so quick it looked like a twitch. Calder understood. Vernon had known Mossy carried something. He hadn't brought her only to scare. He had brought her to extract proof, and to use that proof as leverage. The twist came not as surprise, Calder realized, but as a shift in what the camp's brutality meant. Vernon's voice went low. "Where did you get that?" Mossy's eyes didn't waver. "From the place your hands have never walked." Vernon turned to Calder, speaking like a man organizing a deal. "Hand it over, Calder. I'll forget you interfered." Calder's heart hammered. If he refused, the men would shoot. If he complied, Mossy would be dragged into a story that ended with her disappeared. Both paths were knives. Calder looked at Mossy. Her expression held something new, determination, and a kind of trust that scared him. "We aren't doing this the way you planned," Mossy said, Calder whispered, barely moving his lips. "What do you want?" Mossy's eyes glinted. "You think the vote settles water, but the boundary stone settles memory. If you take it to the right people, they'll hear it." Calder shook his head. "Right people ain't here." Mossy's voice softened. "They're coming. A survey crew from the east. The papers that men read before they steal. They'll arrive when the storm clears. They'll mark the river. And when they do, when they find that old boundary, your camp's river vote becomes an indictment." Vernon heard enough to understand he'd lost control of the story. He moved fast, grabbing for the beaded strip. Calder struck his wrist with the rifle's butt. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to stop. The sound was dull in the enclosed space. The guards surged forward. Chaos erupted. Calder ducked under a swing, grabbed a lantern, and flung it toward the door to throw light and confusion into the night. The shed's coal scattered and smoke rose instantly. The storm air outside mingled with soot from inside. Mossy didn't fight the men the way men expected. She turned her body, used the shed's narrow space as leverage, and slipped between two guards when their eyes were blinded by smoke. Her speed was not brute force. It was survival intelligence. Calder couldn't see her through the smoke clearly, but he heard her move. He heard the tap of her boots on wood. He heard the shed door slam. "Catch her!" Vernon shouted. Calder stood his ground for half a heartbeat longer than he should have. He watched Vernon's face through drifting smoke, watched greed replace rage into cold certainty. Vernon didn't scream like a man losing control. He looked like a man making a plan. Calder understood then. Vernon wouldn't stop because Mossy escaped. Vernon would stop only when he had what he wanted, or when he decided Mossy was too expensive to keep alive. Calder followed the sound of Mossy's footsteps out into the rain-soft night. They ran together along the river's edge, where cottonwoods and willows made shifting shadows. Mossy kept the beaded strip tucked close to her chest. The boundary stone was wrapped again now, as if she feared it might be snatched. "Why tell me about survey papers?" Calder asked, breath ragged. Mossy's face turned briefly toward him. In the dim light, her eyes looked darker, heavier with meaning. "Because you're one of the few men who might carry something without selling it." Calder scoffed. "I ain't noble. You just turned back," Mossy finished. "That is not nothing." They reached a low ridge where the camp's main tents were visible in scattered lantern glow. Farther uphill, the stockpiles and sluice boards lay like skeletons. Calder could see men moving. Vernon had rallied them quickly. Some held lanterns, some held clubs. None held justice. Mossy pressed her hand to Calder's sleeve. "We can't go through the camp," she said. "They'll find us." Calder nodded. "Then we go around." "What if they're watching the river road?" Mossy asked. Calder glanced at the current, at the dark water flowing around stones like hidden hands. "Then we use the river." Mossy blinked. "The river eats." "So did Vernon," Calder muttered. "He tried to use it as a weapon. Maybe the river's the only thing that can turn the weapon back." Mossy didn't argue. She moved quickly, guiding him to an old driftwood line where the water widened. They found a narrow passage between submerged logs, just wide enough for one person to slip through carefully. Calder waded first, boots heavy and water cold enough to steal breath. He moved slowly, using a stone as leverage so he wouldn't lose footing to the current. He felt the river press against his shins like a judgment. Mossy followed, keeping her shoulders above water. Her hair streamed around her face like ink in rain. She kept one hand wrapped tight around the beaded strip to protect it from the water. Calder's chest tightened at the sight. This wasn't just survival. It was guarding meaning. On the far side, they climbed onto mud-streaked banks and collapsed behind a line of boulders. The storm had thinned to a mist now, and the valley's sounds shifted into a quieter, sharper version of night. From the camp, voices carried. Vernon's orders snapped back and forth. Calder heard, "Find the Apache Woman," and "Find the man who helped." Mossy listened without flinching. "They speak like we're something to hunt," she said. Calder's hands shook with cold. He forced them still. "They already did the hunting in their heads." Mossy drew in a slow breath. "They'll try to make you the villain, Calder. That way they can keep being the good men in their own stories." Calder swallowed. "Then we don't give them a story." Mossy looked at him, and her expression softened in a way that made his anger feel foolish. "Stories are all they live on," she said. "But your turning is real. It has weight." Calder didn't know what to do with that kind of praise. On the frontier, compliments could be traps, so he asked the only question that mattered. "Where are you going?" Mossy's gaze lifted toward the dark line of pines beyond the ridge. "To the old channel, where our elders say the water remembers. If you bring the boundary to the survey crew, the channel will be named again. Then my people can stop being treated like trespassers in their own world." Calder felt the truth settle deep. The Apache woman wasn't asking for rescue only from men in a mining camp. She was trying to rescue a boundary from being erased. They stayed hidden while the camp searched and shouted. Calder watched the way Mossy moved even while resting, how she listened for the direction of footsteps, how she angled her body to protect her back. It wasn't only courage, it was strategy. Hours passed. The mist lifted. The eastern sky brightened into a pale gray dawn that made the river look almost gentle. The storm's violence had washed the valley, but it couldn't wash away what had happened. Calder and Mossy didn't return to the shed. There was no point. The camp would expect them to return. Instead, they found a narrow trail leading into a stand of scrub where the ground rose into rocky ridges. As they walked, Mossy's breath came in measured counts. Her wrists had begun to swell under the rope marks. Calder noticed. He tried not to stare. "You should rest," he said. Mossy's lips parted. "Rest is for men who aren't chased." Calder knelt near a stone outcrop and began to gather dry twigs and leaves. "Then we rest quietly," he said. Mossy watched him work. "You're stubborn," she murmured. Calder glanced up, wind tugging at his coat. "So are you." He built a small fire in a hollow lined with stones, keeping it low to avoid drawing eyes. Then he tore cloth from his spare bandage roll and pressed it gently against the rope-rubbed flesh on her wrists. Mossy flinched once, then steadied as if she decided the pain was worth enduring. Her eyes closed for a moment. The act looked like surrender, but Calder knew it was control. "Calder," she said, and he froze at hearing her use his name. "When you first stepped in front of them, you didn't just save my body." He swallowed. "What did I save?" Mossy's eyes opened, copper-brown, shining. "I saw you decide not to become what they were. That is rarer than food." Calder felt heat rise behind his ribs. On the frontier, words like that could change a man's life. He tried to keep his voice neutral, as if he could keep emotion from spilling. "I didn't do it for anything." Mossy shook her head slowly. "Men always do things for something. You did it for the part of yourself that still believes the world can be better." Calder looked at the fire and didn't answer. They traveled that day, cautious of tracks and watchful of riders on distant roads. When they passed a shallow crossing, Calder could see new stakes driven into the bank where the camp had planned its sluice line. The stakes were fresh and bright against dark mud. Vernon had moved quickly after their escape. Calder felt a surge of anger again. He imagined Vernon gathering men around him like a preacher, spinning a narrative to hide the truth. Mossy seemed to sense his thoughts. "He'll blame you," she said. "I know," Calder replied. "He'll call me a criminal," Mossy continued. "He'll call you an enabler. He'll say your rifle was meant to protect your property." Calder's jaw tightened. "And the survey crew, if they come, won't believe either of us." Mossy drew in a breath, slow and controlled. "They won't believe until the land proves it." That night the moon rose pale and thin. Calder and Mossy found a high overlook where they could see the valley's lights. The camp glowed like a bruise. Beyond it, the river glittered faintly, still moving under stars. From the camp, a thin plume of smoke rose. Vernon burning something, Calder suspected, to erase evidence or to cook a new lie. Mossy sat with her back to a rock, shoulders wrapped in wool. Calder watched the boundary strip resting against her chest like a living thing. He couldn't stop himself from asking the question that had been pressing into him since the shed. "Why were they willing to throw you into water?" he asked. "If they wanted your proof, couldn't they just—" Mossy's eyes lowered. "Because the river vote wasn't just for water," she said. "It was for power. It was for who gets to decide what counts as law. If they could make my people disappear, the land would become easy to buy, easy to steal, easy to call yours." Calder stared at the river. It looked calm now, but he knew better. Water carried debris. Water carried memories. Water carried the truth of what happened upstream. "And what about you?" Calder asked, voice barely above the wind. "What did you lose that made you come here?" Mossy's expression went distant. "I lost time," she said. "I lost my chance to keep the boundary safe. I carried it once, then I trusted the wrong people when the camp trading changed hands. I let hope make me slow." Calder felt guilt crack open like old wood. "Then it was your fault," Mossy's eyes snapped to his. "No, it was your world's fault," she said sharply. "My people are hunted because we have memory. Your frontier is full of men who think they can rewrite the past just by driving stakes into mud." Calder's throat tightened. "So you came back to fix it?" Mossy nodded once. "And I needed help that didn't come from my own people because my own people were watching their own borders. I needed a man who could move between worlds." Calder held her gaze. "You chose me." Mossy didn't look away. "I didn't choose you the first time. You chose me when you turned. After that, I needed to see if your turning would become something steadier." The words landed heavy and tender at the same time. Calder didn't know how to answer. The truth was too intimate for a frontier built on distance. So he did the only thing he knew. He stayed. By dawn of the second day, the survey wagon crested the hill road. It was smaller than Calder had expected, but it carried instruments, compass cases, rods, paper bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Men in dusty coats rode behind it, their hats pulled low. Calder's muscles tensed immediately. Mossy tightened her grip on the boundary strip. The survey crew's lead man scanned the valley with a practiced eye. His gaze lingered on the fresh stakes by the river. He looked like a man who believed the world could be mapped and therefore controlled. Calder stepped out from behind the rocks, hands visible, voice cautious. "You're the survey crew?" The lead man blinked, startled by the abrupt appearance of a frontier stranger. "I am. Who are you?" Calder nodded toward Mossy, careful not to make her vulnerability another spectacle. "I'm Calder, and she's Apache." Mossy's face stayed calm, but her eyes sharpened at the word Apache, like she was daring the surveyor to be respectful. The lead man's expression tightened. Prejudice lived in paperwork, too. "Ma'am," he began, then stopped as if he realized he couldn't speak like he was addressing a common laborer. "Are you claiming something on this river?" Mossy stepped forward. Her posture held dignity, not the desperation of someone begging to be believed. "This river boundary was marked before your stakes," she said. The lead man looked skeptical. "We go by official lines, treaties and plats." Mossy reached into her shawl and held the beaded strip and stone up to the light. "Treaties can be stolen," she said. "Memory can't be erased when it's carried." The surveyor studied the stone, turning it slightly. One of the men beside him, an older clerk with ink-stained fingers, leaned in. The clerk's hand hovered, and Calder saw recognition flicker across his face. "This symbol," the clerk murmured. He turned the stone in his palm as if feeling a truth in the shape. "This is from the old boundary notes. I've seen it referenced." The lead man's eyes widened, then narrowed in swift calculation. "Where did you obtain this?" Mossy met his gaze. "From my mother. Carried for as long as the land allowed." Calder watched the surveyor's composure crack into something else, uncertainty and fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being implicated. The lead man cleared his throat. "If we proceed with our measurements," he said slowly, "we can verify the original channel and determine whether your boundary claims align." Mossy nodded once. "Align or condemn those who stole it." In that sentence was the twist that changed everything. The camp had expected Mossy to be a drowning story, a justification. Instead, she arrived with something that could make their entire river vote look like what it truly was, a coordinated attempt to erase a boundary. Calder expected Vernon to intervene. He expected a fight. He expected violence. What happened instead was worse for the camp and safer for Mossy. From behind them, a rider appeared, Vernon himself, followed by 2 guards and a dozen men. Vernon's face was livid when he saw the surveyor's wagon. "You shouldn't be here," Vernon snapped at Calder, then to the lead man, "This woman's interfering. She's deceiving you." The surveyor turned to Vernon slowly, expression controlled. "We were called because of disputed stakes," he said. "These stakes appear freshly driven, but we're also receiving a boundary artifact referencing older notes." Vernon's jaw tightened. "Older notes are for old hands. This is now. The river belongs to whoever can work it." Mossy's gaze flicked to him like a blade. Then you admit your vote was never about law, she said. It was about labor, and labor has nothing to do with stolen memory. Calder watched Vernon's face as the words landed. Vernon's outrage turned into a kind of strategic panic. He had come to stop the survey crew from measuring, but he had been too late. The lead surveyor ordered measurements to begin immediately. Rods were set, papers were pulled out. Men in the camp watched like spectators at a hanging. Calder and Mossy stood together at a respectful distance from the surveyor's work, but close enough that Calder could feel Mossy's tension through the air. When the first readings came, the older clerk went pale. He consulted his notes, then looked at Mossy with something like shame. "This channel," he said quietly, "matches the old boundary notes. The current's altered by the logjam the camp built last week, but the original boundary line aligns." Vernon's face drained of color. "No," he said too quickly. Mossy's voice was steady. "Yes." The lead man's expression tightened into official determination. "Then the camp stakes appear to be improperly placed," he said. "If these men acted to seize access by force rather than measurement, it will be recorded." Vernon stared at him as if the surveyor had betrayed him personally. Then Vernon's anger snapped back into place. He turned on Calder. "You did this," he said. "You brought her to sabotage a business deal." Calder stepped forward, voice firm. "I brought help where you brought a drowning." Vernon looked at Mossy again, and in that look was the final twist. Vernon wasn't only greedy, he was terrified. He had built his plan around the expectation that Mossy would die. With her death, the camp could rewrite everything. But Mossy had survived. She had carried proof, and she had forced the frontier to confront its own violence through the language it respected: measurement, notes, and the inconvenient truth of documented boundaries. Vernon's guards shifted, uncertain. In a world where men expected violence to settle questions, paper and numbers unsettled them. The survey crew began the formal process of documenting. Men in the camp started to distance themselves from Vernon, as if guilt could be shaken off by stepping away. Vernon tried one last move. He stepped close to Mossy, voice low. "Give me that boundary strip," he said, "and I'll make sure you're treated better." Mossy didn't flinch. "Better?" she asked. "You wanted me dead for the sake of your river vote. Now you offer better like it's a trade." Vernon's eyes flashed. "You think your people will reward you for this?" Calder saw the question for what it was, an attempt to break the bond Mossy had forged in her own mind. Vernon wanted her alone again, vulnerable again, small enough to fit into a lie. Mossy's answer surprised Calder, not with softness, but with clarity. "My people already know I survived. They will know I brought proof. That is reward." The words made Calder's chest ache. He realized Mossy had not been rescued into someone else's world. She had brought rescue and meaning into the frontier's violent mouth. When the surveyors finished for the evening, the lead man rode toward the camp with a company of men to secure statements. Vernon stayed behind, glaring at the river as if the water had insulted him. Calder and Mossy walked away from the commotion toward the willows where they had first rested. The air smelled less like smoke now and more like wet earth cooling. Mossy's shoulders sagged slightly once they were out of sight of the wagons. She looked tired, not the tiredness of fear, but the tiredness of carrying a burden too long. Calder didn't ask for more explanations. He simply reached out and offered his coat. Mossy accepted it with both hands, then paused, as if weighing whether to trust him with something intimate. "You stayed," she said quietly. Calder nodded. "You were going to be thrown away." Mossy looked up. Her copper-brown eyes were clearer now, less like a challenge and more like a confession. "I thought no one would turn," she said. "Not after what I'd heard. Not after what your towns do to people they don't understand." Calder's voice roughened. "We don't understand everything. We just do things anyway. That's the problem." Mossy's mouth curved. "Then maybe understanding isn't the thing that saves people." Calder blinked. "What saves them?" Mossy leaned closer, and Calder felt her warmth despite the chill. "The moment someone refuses to let the world harden them," she whispered. Calder's heart hammered at the nearness. He had wanted romance in the stories he'd been fed as a boy, songs and quick kisses, happiness like a saloon's punchline. But this was different. This was the kind of love that grew in mud and blood and moral complexity. It grew slowly, like a plant stubborn enough to reach light through rocks. He looked at Mossy and saw not a reward for his virtue, but a person with her own burdens and decisions. "I ain't asking you to be mine," Calder said carefully. "Not like a claim." Mossy's expression softened further, and Calder realized his fear. The fear that love would become another kind of ownership. Instead, Mossy took his hand and guided it gently to her wrist, where the rope marks still tinged her skin. "Then don't claim," she said. "Help." Calder nodded. "I can do help." Mossy held his gaze. "And I can do choosing," she replied. He didn't kiss her immediately. He waited, letting her decide what pace the frontier allowed. When she finally leaned in, it was slow and real, like the first warmth after a night of rain. Her mouth was cool at first, then warmed with breath and courage. The kiss wasn't sweet like candy. It was sturdy like a promise built to survive cold. Calder felt the storm inside him settle. Afterward, they stood close while the valley's noises returned. Distant hammers, wagon wheels, men arguing over who would be blamed and who could be bought. The frontier kept moving, indifferent and beautiful. Mossy rested her forehead against Calder's chest for a moment, listening to his heartbeat as if it was another kind of language. "What happens now?" she asked. Calder looked out toward the river where the surveyors would finish their work, where stakes would be corrected or removed, where Vernon's narrative would collapse under measurement. "Now," Calder said, "you won't be a story they use to justify cruelty, and I won't be the man who looked away." Mossy's eyes gleamed. "And I won't leave you behind," she said. Calder felt relief so strong it almost hurt. He didn't trust the frontier's promises, but in Mossy's voice he heard something that felt like a boundary no one could erase. In the following days, the camp changed slowly, the way a river changed, by small shifts that added up. Vernon's men were questioned. The disputed stakes were marked. The survey report traveled east on hurried riders, a piece of truth that could not be drowned. When the time came for Mossy to return to her people, Calder went with her beyond the last visible campfire smoke. He didn't bring a gun for conquest. He brought his respect and the knowledge of what it meant to turn back when the world tried to push you forward into cruelty. Mossy's family welcomed her with quiet voices and hands that touched her face as if checking for damage. Their eyes met Calder's, measuring him the way frontier people measured weather. Mossy stood beside him, beaded strip resting against her chest, and Calder realized the boundary had never been only about land. It had been about belonging, to water, to memory, to people who chose each other. Calder and Mossy didn't tie themselves with vows made for other men to gossip about. They tied themselves with actions, staying through uncertainty, sharing warmth through storms, and treating each other's survival as sacred. Long after the gold rush noise faded and the valley's stakes were replaced with recorded lines, Calder would still remember the shed's smoke, the river's roar, and Mossy's steady voice when she said the land remembered. And Mossy would still remember the moment a cowboy turned back, not to win her like a prize, but to stand beside her as the truth rose like morning over water that had been forced to carry lies, until it was made to carry something else.